We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. It's our pleasure to present now The World According to Colour, James Fox in conversation with Yashaswini Chandra. Understanding colour allows us to see works of art in a new way, from Bronze Age gold to Turner, Titian to Yves Klein. It helps us relate to the characteristics of different eras, whether the blue horizons which framed the age of discovery, the pristine aspirations of Enlightenment, or the technicolour innovation of the Industrial Revolution, and the colour which most embodies the environmental crisis which now faces us. In conversation with writer and art historian Yashaswini Chandra, BAFTA-nominated broadcaster and art historian James Fox explores humankind's extraordinary relationship with colour, going deep into the primary colours of black, red, yellow, blue, white, purple, and green. He ranges across the world and throughout history to reveal the meanings that have been attached to the colours we see around us and the ways these have shaped our culture and imagination. James Fox is an art historian at the University of Cambridge and a multi-award-winning broadcaster. He's best known for his broadcasting work for BBC, including the television series The Art of Japanese Life and Age of the Image. His latest book, The World According to Colour, A Cultural History, was published by Alan Lane in October 2021. Yashaswini Chandra is a PhD scholar from SOAS University of London, and her research bridges history and art history. Her recent book is titled The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, and her forthcoming book comprises a woman's history of colonial India. She's an affiliated fellow of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and do tag us at Jaipur Lit Fest. Ladies and gentlemen, The World According to Colour, James Fox in conversation with Yashaswini Chandra.
Hello, James.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very well, and looking forward to discussing this fascinating subject.
Me too, me too. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your brilliant book on colour. You really bring home its significance and the extent to which it fills our lives with joy and meaning.
I'll tell you, it took me a long time to write this book, and it's a really difficult subject to write about because colour is a very slippery, challenging entity that the more you look into it, the more evasive and difficult it becomes. So it took me a long time to write, but it's endlessly fascinating, and as you say, it fills our lives with pleasure and joy as well.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It's very difficult to qualify and quantify. We all know what color is, but to try and sort of map it out, I can imagine how challenging it would have been.
Absolutely, and I sort of begin the book with a comment made by an old Christian theologian called St. Augustine, who said he knew what time was until he was asked what it was. And I think the same thing is true of color. It's something that, it's all around us all the time. We think we understand it, but when you actually have to try to get to grips with it or put it into words, it really becomes very, very difficult indeed.
Yeah. You begin your book with an account of a Persian work, the Haft Paikar or Seven Beauties by Nizami Ganjavi, dedicated to Bahram V, a Sasanian emperor of the 5th century. You write, but its other protagonist is color. Nizami saw color as a microcosm of the universe, connected to the climes, days of the week, and celestial bodies, as well as the 7-stage path towards enlightenment. In Indian culture too, color is used to define different seasons, moods, musical notes, planets, and the days of the week they preside over, even different breeds of certain animals. Would it be correct to say that color has often been used as an ordering principle, and why do you think that would be?
Well, thank you. Yes, I couldn't resist starting the book with that particular work of literature. It's the most fantastic story about this prince who's wandering through his palace. He finds a door he's never seen before. He ends up managing to get into this room, this secret room, and finds all these treasures. And on the side of the wall, on the walls of that room, there is a painting of this great king surrounded by these 7 beautiful women, and he wonders who this man is, and then he discovers the name, and it's himself. And so he sees this as his job to go out and marry these princesses from all over the world, and each of them becomes identified with a specific color. And when he ends up marrying them, he builds 7 palaces around his own in those colors, and he spends a night with each of those princesses surrounded by those colors. So in some ways, his journey around those palaces, his journey through those colors, is a journey through life itself. And I think, as you say, it's absolutely the case that Nizami, like many other people, saw color as a kind of ordering principle of the universe. Absolutely, absolutely true. I mean, in some ways, the oldest idea of that, and in some ways the most enduring one, is the very simplest principle of that distinction we make between darkness and light, between black and white. So often, even in Hollywood films today, you see, you know, the baddies and the evil protagonists wearing black, and you see the goodies in white. And so that old principle that probably goes back to Zoroastrian times, if not earlier, of dividing the world between dark and light is a very, very enduring one. And then you look at, if you go around to see lots of tribes in various indigenous communities around the world, you find they often make a distinction. They divide their world between 3 colors, between black and white and red, black being dark and sin, white being daylight and good, and red being the symbol of humanity and fertility. And then in other cultures, and you've mentioned the Indian culture, you get these very, very sophisticated, very, very detailed, very convoluted sometimes tabulations and correspondences between colors and all kinds of things. So, I mean, you know, in China, for instance, you have this tabulation known as the 5 phases theory, where the colors are associated with the 5 different elements that govern the universe. And in Ayurvedic culture, as you've said, you get the colors linked to days of the week. So, for instance, you know, in the Ayurveda, you have Monday is linked to the moon and to the color white or silver. Tuesday is linked to Mars and red. Wednesday is linked to Mercury and green. Thursday is linked to Jupiter and the color yellow, and so on and so forth. And so there are these ordering principles. And I think if I could try to put my finger on the underlying urge, it's that we as human beings, we love to project meaning into our world and meaning into our lives. And one of the ways we do that is we take the world around us, whether it's the stars in the sky or whether it's the colors that we see in our world, and we try to sort of link them to other things and to make them meaningful, so our lives and our journeys through our lives feel significant and purposeful in some ways.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, because it's like color. Everybody understands color. It's something that goes to, that you can imagine would make for a very obvious ordering principle.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's finding the physical, explicit, legible ways of trying to explain invisible or incomprehensible forces, and that's what color enables us to do.
Absolutely. So you talked about white, the importance of a white, black, and red. So let's concentrate on black to begin with. Black, you explain, is the color linked with the beginning of the world and creation myths from various cultures. The world of light is considered to have pierced through the darkness, and black came to be connected with death, darkness, and emptiness. But you also explain that black is perceived rather differently in Eastern and Western cultures. So tell us about that dichotomy. Tell us about the dichotomy of black.
One of the interesting things when I was researching this book is I started looking at lots of different creation stories from all over the world. Lots of different cultures have their own creation stories. And one thing I found was a very common trope in creation stories was the idea that the universe is created from darkness, or darkness precedes the creation of the universe, and that darkness is usually extremely dark. So the Rig Veda has a passage called the Hymn of the Dark Beginning, which talks about, you know, this unbelievable, endless, bottomless darkness from which creation happens, from which something is made. And most famously in the West, of course, the Old Testament, the Genesis story is about darkness lying on the face of the deep before God separates light from darkness and creates the world and all the beings on it. And what's fascinating about those stories is that they actually have quite a lot in common with modern scientific explanations for the origins of our universe. So, you know, the dominant theory of today is the theory of the Big Bang. The Big Bang arguing that 13.7 billion years ago, that there was an impenetrable darkness, an impenetrable nothingness from which this great spark of creation happened. And actually, I spent a lot of time trying to work out what the Big Bang looked like. And I found out.
In my head, if I had previously thought of the Big Bang, I would have thought of blackness too. I think, it's sort of encoded in us, I think.
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting point to make. Why do we associate blackness with, or darkness with, nothingness, when, you know, there's nothing absent, there's nothing nothingness about black, there's nothing nothingness about the dark either, or about night. But, you know, what's very fascinating about this is that actually that darkness that is supposed to have started at the beginning of the universe, it lasted 380,000 years after the Big Bang. So if you have this idea of the Big Bang happens, bam, a big flash of light, and then suddenly everything's there, that's completely untrue. It took 380,000 years from the Big Bang for the light of the Big Bang to finally appear. 380,000 years, because the early universe was so dense and so hot that actually light couldn't even escape. So it's absolutely the case that, you know, as far as scientists know, that the beginnings of our universe was a kind of an impossibly dense darkness. And I think that that idea, that connection between darkness and absence, darkness and sin, darkness and death, darkness and fear, is one that exists in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world, but in many parts of the world. And it has led to black being really prejudiced views against black. But as you say quite rightly, in certain parts of the world, black is celebrated for its beauty and for the very mystery that I was talking about earlier. So in China and Japan, for instance, especially Japan, you see in the Middle Ages this great cult of blackness emerging, you know, whether it's Japanese inkwash paintings that only use black ink, whether it's the black tea bowls they have, whether it's the creation of black interiors to their homes and dark shadows being cast across those homes. There was a sense that black actually was mysterious and posed questions that couldn't necessarily be answered. And that in itself was seen to be tremendously exciting and inspiring. Yeah,
and now black is, of course, considered a very stylish color.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. It emerges sort of at the end of the 19th century, but really in the 20th century, that when you begin to see black emerging as the color of fashion, you know, the color, the saying goes, you know, X is the new black. So black is seen as a very chic, fashionable color now.
Yeah, that's true. So let's move on to red. You seem to suggest that red is the primordial as well as the most visceral color based on its association with lifeblood, of course, but also the red earth.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating thing if you go back in time and look at the origins and the history of our species. So we think that Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago in Africa. And one of the things that archaeologists have found in some of these very early sites in Africa are huge quantities of red pigments, a red earth pigment known as red ochre or hematite. We find them in very large quantities. So we know that our earliest ancestors were excavating, processing, trading, and using, of course, red pigments in large quantities. And if you go forward by a few tens of thousands of years, you find that during the Upper Paleolithic period, humans were using these pigments and they were burying their dead with these pigments. They were putting them over their bones and their bodies and their possessions when they buried them. They were using them to paint those famous stencils on cave walls. And so red pigments from a very early stage became symbolic of the human presence and the human body. And anthropologists believe it was very much related to things like blood and fertility and virility and power. And of course, that is because although the human body comes in all surface colours, deep down, all of us are made from red meat. Deep down, all of us are sustained and given life by the red blood that is pumping through us, that is made red by this molecule called hemoglobin. When the iron and the oxygen combine in the hemoglobin in our blood, they produce the blood red colour. And I think we have always been aware of the redness of humanity in that sense. If you look at the Old Testament, for instance, the first man that God created was called Adam. And Adam, this was not an accident. The word Adam in Hebrew meant red in part, or red earth. And so we've always got that connection. And I think even today, I still think we identify redness with with the human condition. So much so that, in fact, when we talk about, turning red with rage, or going red with embarrassment, or your face turning red when you're humiliated, or when you're in love with someone, or when you're full of emotion, full of human emotion. So I think that old connection, though it's hundreds of thousands of years old, still exists today.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly backtrack and ask you a question that I should have actually asked you earlier on. Because what I was very fascinated to read when I read the book is that color is perceived rather differently. And perhaps I had learned it in school, but I had clean forgotten that to a large extent, color is the trick of the eye. So there's a certain science which enables us to see color. So
yes.
Tell us about that, actually.
Absolutely. The traditional way of thinking about color is, well, I just find something on my desk here. Here we go. This is my wife's pink notepad. There you go. The traditional way of thinking about
it's purple. We are perceiving color differently.
Well, we're all seeing it differently, don't we? You see how it changes depending on where it is in the light as well. I mean, that's a significant point to make as well. But the traditional way of thinking about this would be to think that the color exists in that book. There is a dye or a pigment in this book, and it is that pinkness or purpleness, whatever we want to call it, is a property of that book. And it doesn't matter who's looking at it, or if anyone's looking at it, it exists as a dimension, if you like, or as a property of that object. But increasingly we're beginning to realize that actually the vast majority of color is actually existing not here but in here. It's made inside our brains. So if I had to very quickly describe how it happens, I mean, first of all, in order to see this color, you need to have light from the world. Then there needs to be some kind of pigment or dye molecule in this cover. And then certain wavelengths of light, the pinky purple ones, are reflected off that surface. And then some of those wavelengths of light will enter our eyes. They will swim through the fluid of our eyes. They will hit the retina at the back of our eyes, where they will trigger certain cone cells. And then those cone cells will, and when they're triggered, will activate a protein, which will activate another protein, which will then convert those signals into electrical messages known as action potentials, which then exit the eye through the optic nerve, hurtle down some fluid-filled threads through the back of our head, then land in the visual cortex of the back of our brain. And then this very complicated computation is undertaken by our brain, in which subtractions and additions are done. And it's only there in the back of the brain that the vibrations of light in the world around us are converted into the pinky purples that we see. So this is not there it's actually in here. And that means that the color itself is a very subjective thing. It's far more subjective than we think it is. And I have no doubt that the color that I'm seeing on this book is different from the color you're seeing and different from the color that everyone else is seeing. And color in that sense is very difficult to get to grips with. You know, it's there was this photograph, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, this photograph of a dress went up online, it went up on the internet. It became this huge global sensation because though everyone was looking around the world at the same photograph of the same dress, they could not agree whether it was a blue and black dress or a white and gold dress. And I think that is, was offered. You can Google it online.
Yeah,
and have a look
I was
now.
just thinking that. I'm going to.
Yeah, you can Google it and then disagree with your partner or your friends, because everyone does seem to disagree. And I think it's perfect evidence of the fact that so much of colour is in the eye or in the brain of the beholder, although we then trick ourselves into thinking it's always existed out there.
So basically, like humans, people see broadly the same colors.
Well,
or can it be dramatically? It can't be dramatically different, surely.
Well, no, there's not. For most people, it's not dramatically different. But of course, you know, everyone's hardware and software of visual perception is different. Everyone's eyes are slightly different. Everyone's brains are slightly different, and so it does lead to distinctions. We know that, for instance, there are a decent proportion of men who are red-green colorblind. And so they are seeing fewer colors than everyone else. We also suspect there are a very small number of women, maybe 1 or 2% of women, who, thanks to a rare mutation on the X chromosome, the chromosome only women have, that they are able to see many more colors than everyone else. They might be able to see millions more colors than every other human being. So I think while most people, these are subtle distinctions, I think for some people, their experience of the colors of our world is very, very different from others.
Yeah, so we were talking about how difficult it would have been for you to do this book. And is that why you decided to classify your chapters along the lines of different colors? And you chose to make case studies of a whole range of colors?
I think so. I think it was a really challenging exercise in structure, this book. You know, some books, they structure themselves, don't they, in some ways? And, you know, you might be telling a chronological history of something, then you just do the chronology. You might be doing a biography of someone, you just follow their life story. You might, but when you're trying to do a sort of history of the world through this kind of slight abstract, slippery thing, it's really quite difficult. And I thought, actually, I did try a chronological approach, but it was too difficult and too messy in some ways. So I thought what I'll do is I'll just take a color at a time and try and work out what I think it means, why I think it's significant. And within that, of course, I ranged as widely as I could chronologically and geographically, but tried to keep in every chapter the main theme of that color running through. And I hope it makes some degree of sense.
No, it does. And that's what actually makes the book fascinating. And in fact, I think you've been quite brave, because as an art historian, you could have stuck to an art historical account, and you could have just talked about the different associations with different artists.
Yes.
But instead, you've decided to write a cultural history, and that's incredible.
Well, that's why it took me so long. That's why it took me 8 years or so, you know, because I started to, you know, I thought, if you're going to talk about the you know, color in art, you have to talk about the science of color. And if you're going to talk about the science of color, you need to talk about the you know, the social and cultural impressions. So gradually, bit by bit, I expanded into lots of other different fields, and that obviously took me a long time to master those other fields, whether it was the philosophy of color or the physics of color or the biology of color, or the linguistics of color. I mean, it's an ever expanding field.
So let's come to one of the other colors that you focus on after black and red, and that let's come to the colors of nature, actually, blue and green. So you argue that blue is a scarce color, but considering that it's the color of the sky and all the water bodies that constitute about 3/4 of the globe, why do you think so? I mean, the color enfolds us at least as much as green. as one of the colors of nature, I would say.
I think that's a very fair point. And what I would say is I think it's important to make a distinction between the blue that exists in surfaces and the blue that exists in depths. So if we begin with surfaces, in surfaces, blue is actually really very scarce. Now, before the creation, the invention of blue dyes and blue pigments, obviously we now have wonderful blue dyes and blue pigments. If you actually think about how many blue things there are, tangible blue things there are in nature, there aren't many. There aren't many naturally blue minerals. You know, you can think of maybe sapphires and lapis lazuli, but there are not many other blue earths and materials out there. There are not many blue woods or things like that. It probably accounts for only about 5% of plants and fruits, the colour. And we know that horticulturalists have been trying for a long time to create blue roses and blue tulips, and they've never been able to succeed in doing that. And it's also the case that while we might be able to think of a number of blue animals, you know, blue butterflies, amphibians, reptiles, and things like that, none of them actually possess, or very few of them actually possess any blue pigment at all. I've got another little prop here for you. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. This is a blue butterfly here. Which is one of the most beautifully blue creatures on the planet. But when scientists actually started to look at these wings through a microscope and to grind down the material, they found that there wasn't any blue pigment in this butterfly at all. That this butterfly is actually brown, and it simply creates an illusion of blueness by having all these little microscopic scales across the surface of the wing that knock white light out of phase. So it creates this illusion of blueness. And that is the same thing for people with blue eyes. I know there are lots of people out there who are proud of their blue eyes. Blue eyes do not possess any blue pigment at all. In fact, we think that only of all the 64,000 vertebrate species in the world, probably only two kinds of fish have been found to possess blue pigment. So that's the first thing I'll say, is that, you know, in terms of actual things, material things, blue was quite absent. And you're completely right that in the other realms, in the realms of depth, we have huge amounts of blue. You look up to a beautiful clear sky, wow, you've got a vast stretch of blue. You look to the oceans, you've got beautiful vast blues, but those blues again aren't really real. The sky appears blue because of a process called Rayleigh scattering, and this is as light comes in through the atmosphere, the nitrogen molecules scatter blue wavelengths of light across the sky, which makes the sky look blue, although the real color of the sky is black, which we only see at night time when the light is not distracting us. Similarly, the sea, it mostly appears blue because it's reflecting the illusory blueness of the sky. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is I think it's that combination of presence and absence that blue has that other colors don't really have. It's this sense that it's around us, but it's out of reach. It's something that we can see, but we can't necessarily touch or handle, that is part of blue's great cultural significance. And I wonder whether, you know, the Hindu deities, I've never got to the bottom of this, why Hindu deities might be depicted with blue skin, because it's a way of, or some Hindu deities depicted with blue skin, because it's a way of depicting a being or a body that is other, that comes from another place, that is different, rather than something that feels human. So I think that, of course, nowadays, we are able to manufacture all kinds of blues. They're still very difficult to make compared to other colors. And so we've lost sight to some extent of how mysterious and scarce a physical color it was for a long time.
Do you think that's what made it very alluring?
I think so. I mean, survey after survey shows that blue is the world's favorite color. It's a very, very popular color. People love it around the world. And I wonder whether, one of the reasons we love it is that it is something that it's often at a distance. It's often hard to pin down. It's you know, we talk of deep blue a lot, don't we? We don't usually say deep yellow or deep orange, but we say deep blue because we associate blue with something that is deep and distant and somehow magical and mysterious.
That's right. But as you pointed out, different shades of blue have started being manufactured now at great expense. It's an expensive pigment. So historically, what are the materials that blue would be derived from?
Yes. So in the earliest human cultures, there was no blue. The earliest human cultures had so-called earth colors. They had blacks and whites and browns and yellows and reds that they could dig up from the earth. But because, as I said, there wasn't much blue earth around or blue stones around, they didn't have blue pigments to use. It was really only in the Neolithic period, so much later on, that we started to make blue dyes and blue pigments. So the first major blue dye was indigo, named after India, although we think it probably first emerged in the Central America thousands and thousands of years ago. This was a dye made from the indigo plant.
Yeah, and that has a loaded history of colonization in India.
Absolutely does have a loaded history, and it was a site of a great deal of exploitation by the British during the 19th century, when it was an extremely valuable commodity. And it was only in the 1890s when the German chemists were able to synthesize a synthetic form of indigo, synthetic indigo, that started to put an end to that huge and very destructive industry that was taking place in India under the British. Through the 18th and 19th centuries. I think that the other blue pigment that emerged in the ancient world was the first ever synthetic blue pigment, which was invented by the Egyptians about 2,500 years ago. But beyond that, it was very, very difficult to make blue. One of the most famous blues emerges in the Middle Ages. It's made from lapis lazuli that comes from Afghanistan into this beautiful blue pigment called ultramarine. But then there are only probably a handful of other blues that emerge in subsequent centuries because it's just so difficult to make. And it's really only in the 20th and 21st centuries that you start to see a couple of other new blues emerging. You see cerulean blue emerging in the 19th century. You see phthalocyanine blue, which is a synthetic dye, emerging in the 1930s. There's a brand new blue that was only went on the market last year, which had been invented in the United States, called Oregon blue. Invented by a great Indian chemist, in fact, in the University of Oregon, which is looking like it's going to be one of the most important blues of the for the coming century. But really, in terms of the number of blues that have been invented in history, they're not many. It's like purple; it's very difficult to make.
Yeah, and I think you're right. What you said about certain deities being blue colored in sort of Indian art, and what that could mean. Well, it's actually that blue color is actually supposed to represent a dark complexion.
Yes.
So, the Lord Krishna, Shiva, they all depicted blue. They were supposed to have been blue in the sense of being dark complexioned. I mean, in that sense, a dark complexion is valorized. But we also have that concept of blue-blooded.
Yes.
So it sort of sets people apart. It's supposed to set people apart.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you say. And one of the interesting things about blue in general is that it's a color that is, unlike most other colors, it's a color that is akin to both darkness and light. It's a color that, if you see blue, it could be associated with the color of moonlight and of the midnight sky, but it could also be associated with the midday sky on a sunny day. And so blue has this wonderful ability to move between dark and light. We also know from a from a physiological perspective, that we see blues better than any other colours at nighttime. That is why most emergency vehicles have flashing blue lights, so you can see them more easily at nighttime. And that's why we often think, the moonlight is blue when actually it's not blue at all. And we often, when films are made, they put a blue filter across the camera to make it look like it's a nighttime scene if they're shooting day for night. So we think of night and darkness as having a blue cast to it, a blue tinge to it, which I think would link to some of the things you're saying as well.
So how did green become the color of Islam, a religion that arose in the deserts of Arabia but envisaged paradise or Jannat, the ultimate goal of the faithful, as a verdant garden, a process that we could say culminated with the tomb gardens of Mughal India?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, Islam emerges in one of the driest and most arid and least green parts of the world. It emerges obviously in modern day Saudi Arabia, and yet the Quran is absolutely filled to the brim with descriptions of vegetation, with descriptions of your beautiful green trees and flowers and rain and crops emerging from the soil. It's this extraordinary, very, very vivid descriptions of vegetation flourishing and thriving. And of course, the Quran contains a description of paradise itself as a garden. Now, it wasn't the first religion to come up with the idea of paradise as a garden. Obviously, it goes back to ancient Mesopotamia, and certainly the Old Testament had the idea of the Garden of Eden. But the Quran describes in great detail the kind of garden that was paradise. It was a garden divided into four by these streams. It had orchards and beautiful fruits growing, and it was very explicit, the Quran, about the greenness of that garden. So that it speaks of the people who are in this paradise garden wearing green, sitting on green cushions and sofas. And actually, not many people know that the shortest verse in the entirety of the Quran is just one word long, and that word is green.
Really?
It's the word, there's the only one word verse in the entirety of the Quran is the word madamatam, which means a very particular kind of dark green that describes the green of the trees of paradise. And of course, many great Islamic artists created their own versions of these paradise gardens. And I do think, as you mentioned, I think the culmination of that aspiration comes in the great gardens of Mughal India, which do try to simulate the structure of paradise. So if you go to those gardens, if you go to I suppose the most famous being not so much for the garden but for the building, but if you go to the Taj Mahal, you see that garden itself, which was far more important than it is now, and in the past was filled with orchards and fruit so dense that you sometimes couldn't even see the building, and it's now mostly a green lawn. But that garden is divided into four by the streams, just as the Quran says the Paradise Garden was. And as you go through that initial building to go into the Taj Mahal, there is a passage from the Quran that says, enter my paradise. This is paradise itself. And I think we also know from the Quran, but more so from other later texts, the Hadith, for instance, that Muhammad himself was a huge fan of green, that he wore green clothes. He spoke again and again and again about the beauty of green. He said once that actually only three things in life could make you happier: water, greenery, and a beautiful face. So greenery was obviously very
such an aesthete.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And I think that in the after his death, green became a great symbol of Muhammad, and you start to see, the Fatimids and other groups having green flags to celebrate Muhammad. And even today, the Islamic world is awash with green. The domes in the mosques are often green. You see lots of green flags. You see people wearing green headdresses, lots of green logos of Muslim organizations. And of course, many Islamic countries have green on their flags, sometimes entirely green on their flags. So I think green remains this very, very strong connection to Islamic culture.
So now we're about to come to the end of the session. And what the question that I must ask you is, which is your favorite color, of course?
Well,
but more so, which color were you most excited by in the course of writing this book, based on the symbolism that you uncovered?
well, it's a
Please
good
don't
question.
say blue.
Well, I was going to say it, but maybe I shouldn't. But what I would say is that, I'm very unoriginal in that, blue was, going into writing the book, blue was my favorite, probably my favorite color. Although, it's important to say that every color has so many different versions that, there are horrible blues, there are horrible sort of greeny gray blues, but there are also beautiful violety blues. So every color has beautiful versions of itself and versions that you might not like so much. But I did certainly go into writing the book feeling very strongly about blue. And as I say, I'm not alone in that. We know that in these surveys that have been done, there was a survey done about 10 years ago, a massive survey of 50 countries around the world on every different continent. And they found that in every single country, blue was the favorite color. And by a staggering margin, somewhere between 30 and 45% of people, so almost half in some cases of all people, call blue their favorite color. So I was one of those. But actually, during the course of writing the book, the color that I really came to respect and love more than any other was black. And I think black has as I was saying earlier, has had a bad press through history. We often think of it as not even a color, as an absence, as something that's evil or sinful or scary. But actually, when you start to look at the history of black in art, you look at those inkwash paintings, you look at the way that great artists all over the world have used that extremely potent, rich, deep color, you begin to see that actually its potentials are limitless. And I do think black has this ability that other colors don't have, which is it's not only bottomless in its richness and in its depth and in its power, but it's also very altruistic. You put black next to any other color, and that other color will shine, it will pop, it will get even more beautiful. And so I think
also
black
shine in black.
Yeah, what did you say? The shining black.
I said people also shine in black.
I think people look great in black as well. Exactly. Black is an extraordinarily altruistic color in that sense, and so I think I have increasingly fallen in love with black's wonderful possibilities. And it's a mysterious color. It doesn't, it draws you in. It doesn't give you the answers.
Okay, fantastic. It was a pleasure talking to you. This is an absolutely fantastic book, and I would recommend it highly to all the viewers. Is it available in India?
I think it will be very soon available in India.
No, that'll be fantastic. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James Fox and Yashaswini Chandra, for such fascinating insights into the world of colors and how they shape our lives. Please do stay tuned in for the next session. And now presenting a JLF Writer Shorts.